Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to Constructing a New Social Compact, a public forum on empowering the post-pandemic working class. I'm Lane Wyndham, the Associate Director of the Kalmanovitz Initiative for Labor and the Working Poor, and we are thrilled that you've chosen to be here with us today. Our session today is the future for workers and the future of work, a very important topic to discuss. Just a couple announcements. Today's discussion is being recorded, and we are going to make all the recordings available on our website over the coming weeks. And also, today's event is part of a 4-day virtual convening featuring more than 25 sessions with 150 presenters from 5 continents. And so we hope you can join us. I'm going to put the full schedule there in the chat. We hope that you can join us for a number of the events. We've had a terrific organizing committee. And I want to give a huge thank you to the Friedrich Ebert Foundation for sponsoring our convening. Okay, so now I'm going to turn this over to Tom Juravich, who's a professor at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Tom, thank you for doing this and leading us through this conversation, and I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you, Lane, and thank you, Lane and Joe, for all your work in organizing this event. It's been terrific. And you know, in thinking about constructing a new social compact, examining it, exploring it, unpacking that, I don't think that's possible without really thinking about the fundamental changes that are taking place in workplaces around the world. I mean, if you think about it, the compact in the US that came out of the New Deal was really rooted on standardized employment. And that standardized employment in terms of is being really challenged by the emergence of precarious work, of gig work, of platform work. And it's so important that any rethinking of the social compact include this new employment reality. And we hope that the papers today will add to this discussion. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. I'll introduce our panelists before they give their presentation. I'm asking them to take 12 to 15 minutes to deliver their remarks. I'd ask you if you would please keep your microphone muted during that time. We love to see your faces, so please put your cameras on if you can, because it's much more fun to talk to our colleagues than just blank spaces. And then we will have plenty of time at the end for questions. We've designed this so that we should have a good amount of time for questions. And you can do that 2 different ways. You can either go live and indicate that you'd like to ask a question, and and you turn on your microphone, we'll indicate you can ask a question, or you can also ask questions through the chat function. So either one of those are perfectly acceptable. Okay, so let's get started. Our first paper is from Rani. And Rani is a senior economist at the research department of the International Labor Organization, the ILO. She's a development economist and has recently published the ILO flagship report, World Employment and Social Outlook 2021, the role of digital labor platforms in transforming the world of work. So we'd like to welcome Uma to talk a bit about that research. Welcome, Uma.
Thanks, Tom, for having me as part of the panel today and to discuss this work. Just a minute. So what I'm going to do in the 15 minutes that I have, I'm going to give you sort of a glimpse of what we have done in this report, the role of digital labor platforms in transforming the world of work, which is becoming a part of our everyday lives. And the report actually discusses the transformations that this is bringing about to the world of work. Now, if you see the last decade, especially, the platforms have grown at a rapid pace. We see that there's been a 5-fold increase in the number of platforms, whether it be the delivery or the taxi or online web-based platforms across the globe. And we also see that these are concentrated in certain parts of the world, with about 29% of them being in United States, about 8% in India, and 5% in United Kingdoms. Now, the rise of digital labor platforms has largely been enabled due to the availability of technological innovations like cloud computing and infrastructure, which have enabled economic transactions and the exchange of large amounts of data and information between individuals, businesses, and devices. Now, data is increasingly becoming a key asset, and it is driving the digital economy. And it is also led to the development of the rise of machine learning algorithms and algorithmic management practices. Now, these developments have also been supported by the availability of venture capital funds, which have increased tremendously over the past decade, and they're concentrated in particular sectors and regions of the economy, of the world. Now, the result of all of this has been innovative ways of working and flexibility for both workers and businesses. And during the COVID-19 pandemic, what we have seen that is there has been a further reinforcement in their role in the economy. Sorry. Sorry, guys. Now, the digital labor platform business model is actually transforming the world of work in a number of ways. Now, there are three ways in which they are transforming the world of work, according to us, and I'd like to actually point this out to you. The first is through the algorithmic management of practices of allocation of work, evaluation, monitoring, and reward of work. The second, platforms are in a big way changing the organization of work and work processes and shifting the responsibility of investing in capital assets to the workers. Now, this could be cars in the case of taxi drivers, or it could be computers in the case of online web-based workers, where not only the capital cost, but also the corporate operating costs of whether it is fuel, internet, or electricity is actually transferred onto the workers, which would have otherwise in a traditional business model being taken up by the firm. Now, this clearly makes platforms asset light. The third, which is the most worrying for us, is the creation of a dual labor market with a core workforce of internal employees, which you can see in the blue on the right-hand side of the slide, and the largely mediated external workforce, which you see in millions in the green. And I think this is where the entire issue of this kind of a platform business model and the concerns with regard to the future of work actually emanate, as a large part of the work is actually executed by these externally mediated workforce. Now, what we have seen is, irrespective of the platforms that you talk about, whether it's the taxi, delivery, or different types of online web-based platforms, their main characteristic features of the business model are very similar across all of these sectors. They all rely on network effects and algorithmic management practices to operate the businesses. The business model of these platforms is based on commission fees or subscription plans, which accounts for the major source of revenues, with a considerable proportion of them coming from different types of fees that are actually charged to workers. And to develop their network effects, many of these platforms actually increase the number of users, both workers and clients, by using different types of incentive mechanisms, which are often funded by venture capital financing. Another characteristic feature of these platforms is that the rules of governance on these platforms are unilaterally determined by themselves, with hardly any consultations with social partners at governments. And some of these terms of service agreement have exclusivity clauses, deactivation of accounts when they can work and whether they cannot work, dispute resolution mechanisms, among others, which have huge implications on the workers. And this is something we are going to have a quick look at it now. Now, who are these platform workers that we are talking about? Now, they are young, but not too young. They are between the age of about 29 and 36 years on average, depending upon the type of platform we are talking about. They're often highly educated, particularly in developing countries, with 60% of them having university degrees on online web-based platforms and about 20% of them in taxi and delivery platforms. They're mostly men, but women are also finding work. That is about 40% of them on online web-based platforms and 1 in 10 workers on location-based, largely in taxi and delivery. But if you look at some of the sectors like domestic workers or care work, you find that a larger proportion of women are actually engaged in it. Now, these platforms do provide opportunities for persons with disabilities and migrant workers, but they are classified as independent contractors or partners or self-employed, which creates major issues and problems for them. Now, what motivates these workers to perform these tasks on the platforms? It differs across platforms. On some, it is to complement pay or because of the flexibility it provides. On competitive programming platforms, it is to improve skills and career opportunities, while on taxi and delivery, it is largely because of lack of alternative employment opportunities. And it also provides some sort of flexibility for some of them. For many women in both developing and developed countries, working from home and work flexibility is another motivating factor because of which they use these platforms, which are often not available in the traditional labor market. Now, while there are these opportunities, there are certain concerns that emerge on working from platforms, and one of them relates to earning. Now, the ILO survey of about 12,000 workers actually captured information on hourly earnings, which varies across sectors and occupation. On average, the hourly earnings are low on online work, and we find that 50% of the workers receive actually less than US dollars 2.1 on these platforms. And one of the reasons why the earnings are low are perhaps as a result of competition among global labor force, but also because of other factors such as commission fees, rejection of work, unpaid labor time for searching apart from the task, which is about 8 hours in a typical week on an online web-based platform. For taxi and delivery platforms, what we find that workers earn between $1.1 to $8.9 per hour, and it also includes bonuses and other incentives that workers actually get as part of this work. Now, what is very important to keep in mind is that commission fees for the workers actually varies across platforms, and it is between 5 to 25% on taxi and 20 to 35% on online web-based platforms, which has a major impact on their worker incomes. Now, this fee constitutes a very large share of the platform company's revenue. And in one instance, we found that 60% of the revenue form the commission fees charged to the worker in one of the platforms. On location-based platforms, workers work quite long hours to actually get this kind of an income that they actually receive. The other observation we would like to present is that workers in developing countries tend to earn less than that of developed, and there's a significant gender pay gap that actually exists on many of these platforms. Now, COVID-19 has also impacted the availability of work and income for many of these workers on online web-based platform. Supply has been rising faster than the demand, especially in developing countries, which is leading to underbidding or of price to ensure work. On location-based platforms, many workers had to take a break, and 9 out of 10 taxi drivers and 7 out of 10 delivery workers reported a decline in demand. And for 90% of the taxi drivers and 70% of the delivery workers, COVID-19 had major consequences for the financial situation of their household, which meant borrowing, reducing consumption, or moving from urban areas to rural areas so as to actually meet their family needs. Algorithmic management practices is actually defining everyday experiences of the workers, and it has major implications on them. Now, worker ratings are very decisive for accessing work on these platforms. Further rejection or refusal of work can lead to lower ratings and have negative impacts on work. Ratings below a certain particular threshold could lead to deactivation of accounts. Further, the entire notion of flexibility and freedom that is often propagated on these platforms is challenged, as workers are often monitored on a regular basis using different tools and tracking devices. And they are often required to be available during specific hours, which can be beyond the regular working hours, as the clients are based in a different time zone. Social protection is again very poor for a majority of the workers, and one finds that there are huge gaps in health insurance, work-related injury provision, unemployment disability insurance, and old age pension or retirement benefits. Now, this got quite exposed during the COVID-19, where 7 out of 10 workers indicated not being able to take paid sick leave or receive compensation in the event they were to test positive for the virus. I think an important point that needs to be also considered by looking at the platforms is the entire redefinition of the relationship between formal education and access to work. And this is something we saw across all the platforms. Now, one of the issues, I think this is very important for this panel, is to understand that working conditions on these platforms, as already mentioned, is regulated by the terms of service agreements, which challenges a number of labor rights for the workers. And many challenges like collective bargaining and unionization actually remain, and they are prohibited in competition law. And it also makes it very difficult as workers are dispersed geographically and across platforms, though some efforts have been taken to actually address them. Now, countries have actually, because of the entire employment relationship issue, countries have adopted varying mechanisms to address some of the challenges, which is very encouraging to see as they are rapidly adapting and strengthening the labor market institution, which includes certain social protection schemes to occupational safety and health, to classifying workers as employees and not self-employed. But I think what is very important to bear in mind is the diverse regulatory responses at country level. Now, this we argue at the ILO is not enough and adequate because platforms operate across all over the world and across multiple jurisdictions. So the only way to effectively protect workers and businesses would be through a coherent, consistent, and coordinated international effort. And for this, the ILO urges for an international policy dialogue and coordination, which is vital to have common regulatory solution. And it has actually come forward with a policy recommendation around 15 fields. And some of this has been highlighted here. And I think I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Oh, Uma, how wonderful. Thank you. And I don't know how you possibly were able to give such a great summary of a very long report. And I hope that you'll put a link to the report in the chat so that people could take a more in-depth look. But we very much appreciate you summarizing that incredibly important work. Our next presenter is Raoul Gebert, who serves as an assistant professor at the University of Sherbrooke in their business school. He's affiliated as a co-researcher with the Inter-University Research Center for Globalization and Work that's based in Montreal. And his research interests center on labor relations, public policy, and globalization. Prior to returning to academia, he worked as chief of staff to the leader of the New Democratic Party in Canada and as a project manager for the German-based think tank Friedrich Ebert Foundation. And today, Raoul is going to speak about gig economy workers in Canada and their collective bargaining rights. Welcome, Raoul.
All right, I will try to get this presentation going. I hope this works. Please let me know if it doesn't. I'll just presume that I can start. So first of all, my apologies for the psychedelic colors. I did not do the branding for Foodora. They did, and the fuchsia is their color. So this is about gig workers in food delivery, notably Foodora workers that organized in Toronto over the past 2 years. And I'm going to try to connect it to the different issues, of course, that Uma raised in her great presentation. And it's really at the core of the legal question around what is an independent contractor. So in the Canadian context, we'll see there are some provisions that actually do help getting some labor recognition and labor rights for these contract workers. Now, of course, already we have a problem because it does not want to skip to the next slide. Now it does. There is our food delivery market. So you can already see the impact of the pandemic here. 1.5 billion in 2019, 3.5 billion Canadian dollars projected to be in 2021, so more than doubled. And the pie chart here are the main competitors pre-pandemic. Skip the dishes if the logo looks familiar. It's because they are an affiliate of Just Eat, a British company, but it's a homegrown Canadian outfit that is actually the largest competitor. DoorDash, which is a little bit smaller here, Uber Eats, which is the second, and Foodora, which is what we're going to cover today. Now, Foodora as a company is a part of a German multinational called Delivery Hero. They operate lots of brands on different continents. And the employee number here, and this is exactly what Uma just had in her report, these are just the people working directly for the various brands or companies, headquarters in the different countries. This does not, by any stretch of imagination, include the actual couriers that are delivering the food. In terms of sales, Delivery Hero is about half the size of Uber Eats, but it is larger than Just Eat. And in 2015, it decided to enter the Canadian market, and it had quite an aggressive sort of scheme in terms of pricing, but was on the high end in terms of these commission fees that Uma was talking about. So up to 30% that went into their pockets. And now you ask yourself, how can they have high markups but low prices? Well, guess what? It's the restaurants and the couriers that were paying the price of that. And Foodora grew very aggressively in the various Canadian cities, and right into 2019 when finally there was an organizing drive that started, but we'll get to that in a second. I want to zero in on the independent contractor situation, and some of this Uma had already in her slides. So one criteria generally is that contractors are supposed to be able to accept or refuse jobs, and this is done via an application that the couriers have to download on their phones. There's a fee that is proposed per kilometer. Sometimes it's per delivery. Sometimes there's a bit of a waiting time that's being paid as well, but generally it's not. Generally, it's a job that is to be accepted. You know beforehand what the fee is, and then you can refuse it or accept it. However, once you accept it and you don't make the time deadline, there may be penalties. And certainly if you refuse too many jobs that are proposed to you, then there may also be penalties at the end of your week. Because funny enough, you don't have to send an invoice, you get a regular paycheck, believe it or not. Equipment you have to buy yourself. That is one of the main requirements under Canadian law. You have to own all of your work equipment in order to be considered an independent contractor. So these funky fuchsia backpacks, that comes off your first paycheck, of your first invoice that you're sending to your fully independent, through your fully independent work, of course. Vacation and sick days that was mentioned by Uma. This is the workers' risk if they get sick, if they need time off, if they need to take care of their families. That's not covered. And that actually kind of fits with another legal requirement, which is that the worker or the independent contractor has to assume the economic risk of the activities that they are doing. And the fifth element is control. They're not supposed to, independent contractors are supposed to control their own schedules, the way they are going about their business. And of course, the app will suggest certain routes of how to get from A to B, and that's what they're paid based on. The kilometers are based on whatever the app determines the best route is. However, the scheduling and the routes are obviously so tightly organized with these apps that you barely have any control left over your workday. And then some of the problems that were also mentioned, so workman's comp, and I'll get to a rather horrendous example in a second. You see these streetcar tracks in Toronto. They're quite bad for bikers. So there's dooring incidents. I mean, biking in the Canadian context in the winter, obviously with ice and snow and everything, it's accident-prone work, and it's not always automatic that these fine folks are covered by workman's comp. It's a bit more complicated than that. I don't want to get into that detail. Some actually are. But certainly if your bike breaks, for example, in an accident, then you have to replace that bike yourself. One element that I hadn't even thought about, maybe as a guy doing this research and doing some of these interviews, is the harassment and sexual assault issues, especially female workers in this business. There aren't a lot, but those who are all reported to me. Essentially, they have to use their own phone to contact the clients sometimes, and then all of these clients end up with their personal phone numbers. Now you can imagine the kind of problems and the kind of text messages and invitations they get afterwards, and they have to pay for then applications that will mask their own phone numbers, and all of this stuff is actually quite upsetting, and certainly a problem that I hadn't imagined. And then the pandemic hit, and Delivery Hero actually claims that they will deliver anything to anyone, not just food, and so they did. They were, among other things, delivering medication to people who were sick with various sicknesses during the pandemic, and of course that it becomes a health and safety issue for the workers if they don't actually know what they're delivering to whom. But this was part of the jobs that they were supposed to accept during the first lockdown in April 2020. Now, this test of an independent contractor, we'll come back to it in a second as the legal issues went on. I just want to briefly talk about the organization drive. Foodsters United sprung up based on some of these grievances that I just mentioned. There was one union that didn't work out too well. There was no good fit with that union. The postal workers came in, and this is not the logo of the postal workers, but I found a postal worker on a bike, so that kind of fit nicely together with the presentation. And CUPW, the Union of Postal Workers, did have a history in organizing bike couriers and in organizing so-called dependent contractors, or supposedly independent contractors, but then organizing them as dependent contractors in the rural postal delivery. So you can imagine Canada, lots of rural postal roads, and it's sort of a similar model. You bring your own van, you bring your own car, and you deliver the mail to all of these rural places. And that was an independent contractor job right until the 90s. And finally, the Canadian Union of Postal Workers actually fought for these folks to get a new classification of dependent contractor, which then allows them to bargain collectively under the Canadian Labor Code. There was a vote. The certification was rather quickly, sorry, not the certification, the request for certification followed very quickly. They had a huge sign-up campaign between May and August in 2019. There was a vote. The votes were sealed because the company was challenging that they even had the right to unionize, of course, and so the votes were sealed. But in the end, when it was revealed, it was 88.8% of folks voting it. And this is the issue, respect and occupational health and safety. You have this quote that became quite viral in this whole campaign. Sorry, I'm in pain. I've been hurt, and the only text message that came back, can you complete the order? Which is just, you can just imagine how that feels like when you are having clearly other problems than getting somebody their pizza. Now, as I said, Foodora claimed that these couriers shouldn't be considered unionizable as independent contractors. And what they brought in as proof is that they were double apping, called double apping, meaning they could work at the same time from competitors if they installed several apps from several competitors. I mean, in reality, it's kind of hard to do because once you sign in, you don't have any time at all to consider offers or requests from other apps. But in practice and in theory, yes, they could, and they usually did have several apps going and working for one on one day and for another app on another day. They had the freedom to reject deliveries. Of course, they could reject as many as they wanted, and they owned their own means of production. Of course, Foodora would never use the words means of production, but I'm using them. This was sort of proof, supposedly, that these were independent contractors. Now, in response, the union decided not to ask for salaried employee status because I think that would have been risky and probably wouldn't have worked out so well. They filed for something called dependent contractor status, which there had been quite a bit of precedence on this. It's been included in the Canadian Labor Code since the 80s. There've been rulings, there's been jurisprudence on it since the 1930s in Canada. So this concept exists, and there's a test. The test is basically control plus economic dependency, and economic dependency is the main test, and in this case, the double apping was rejected as an argument that they were not economically dependent. But the control aspect was just too clear. The performance scores being deprioritized, getting penalties, and even a notice of termination, which is really something that's usually reserved to salaried employees. In the end, the OLRB ruled that these folks are dependent contractors, and as any respectable multinational, when they lose a case in front of a labor court, they head for the hills. And it's actually what happened in Australia as well. So Foodora closed up shop in Canada in May 2020, right in the middle of the pandemic, saying that the market was saturated. Now, if you remember that slide, 2 slides back, that the market has actually more than doubled, then obviously you know that was not a correct argument. And but there's another case now in front of the same labor relations board, and that's the Uber drivers. So we're not in food delivery, but in taxi, and the Uber drivers have sort of exactly the same argument in front of the exactly same labor relations board. So we hope that will be a similar result. Post Foodora, the union sort of had to work things a little bit. They had started out as a very tight-knit group, but had to branch out to the car drivers, because Foodora also didn't employ car drivers, but also had car drivers as contractors. And how did they do this? Lots of self-help seminars, lots of solidarity on a day-to-day basis. You can imagine getting your bike ready for Canadian winters is quite a thing. And parking tickets. They really managed to help the car drivers with the parking tickets. CUP-W continued to fight for the workers even after Foodora left. They negotiated a settlement, and then Foodsters United, that grassroots group, sort of facilitated who would get how much and what would be a fair deal for the different members. And well, they're even having some future ideas, and including eventually potentially opening some sort of a cooperative model in the sort of delivery world, which is where they came from. The Hurrier company that was bought over by Foodora was a sort of local startup with a very local community feeling to it. So we'll see what comes off this. What can we take away from all this? Obviously, with the pandemic having aggravated, increased this line of work by a lot, the gig economy isn't going anywhere. And it's growing exponentially. So there needs to be ways of including these workers in our labor relations institutions and organizations. They're often vulnerable workers that are in this line of work. I think Uma has mentioned that as well. And there's a couple of things sort of in terms of the way forward. How can we go about this? that come out of this case study. It's about resources, but also about resourcefulness, right? So you can come in as a well-resourced, old style labor union, put a lot of resources in, but you also have to really be in touch with this particular group of workers who have a very different vibe and a very different feeling to it. And I don't want to go into all of these points in detail, but certainly a narrative is the other point that I would say is so important. So there's a group now called Gig Workers Rising, which is trying to create some solidarity between different gig workers in Toronto and beyond, to just get a narrative going that, yes, you can be a contractor and you can own your own bike and do work for many apps, but you still get to bargain collectively, and you still deserve protection, and you still deserve respect from your respective employers. I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Raoul. And I have to say, I really like the color. It brightened up my screen this dreary afternoon here. And thank you so much for bringing that perspective from Canada. It is so relevant to what we're facing here as well. So thank you again for the presentation. Our next presentation is Alex Quesnel, who is a graduate student in political economy at Carleton University. He also works part-time as a research and policy analyst for the federal government of Ontario. And this fall, he will begin a PhD in geography at York University in Toronto. And this afternoon, he's going to speak about his paper, Data Labor in Platform Capitalism, towards remuneration or decommodification. Alex, welcome.
Thanks, Tom. Appreciate that. I'm going to share my screen here. So good afternoon, everybody. My presentation is going to cover my master's research on data commodification and platform capitalism. So I'd like to begin with an overview of some of the major problems inherent in the current economic system, which I describe as platform capitalism. One, obviously, the rampant wealth inequality evident between the owners of the platforms versus the gig workers, or just simply the users of the platforms. Another is datafication, including the non-consensual extraction of the data on platforms from Amazon to Facebook to Uber. And then another is the looming threat of automation, that this data that is collected on these platforms will train AI, machine learning, in turn fueling the financial speculation associated with these tech firms. And so we seem to be at this sort of crisis point, and something needs to be done. So what is the solution for this? For these problems? One is, championed by Silicon Valley elites, is to treat data production as a form of labor and pay people for it. And on the left, you see an Economist article from 2018 titled "Data Workers of the World Unite." And on the right here, I have a clip from an excerpt from a 2019 book chapter from Eric Posner, a University of Chicago economist, and Glenn Whale, a Microsoft researcher, who argue that personal data should be honored as your dignified work and compensated as such. So rather than the growing prowess of digital systems being seen as AI that would replace our jobs, this framework would be seen as a new source of well-paying jobs. Now, I understand data labor is a distinct subfield within digital labor studies, and I'll outline some examples of how that's been described in the literature. In regards to mass media, the viewers of the audience in mass media has long kind of been described as workers, from Dallas Smythe in the 70s to describing the audience commodity with respect to television, radio, print media. But Christian Fuchs more recently has updated this for the social media platform era, describing Facebook usage and YouTube usage as a form of work, which is, I guess, like a subject of debate within scholarly circles. But also, data labor is a known concept within the gig economy as well. And this has been described by Niels van Doorn and Adam Badger as dual value production. This idea that the value is produced by the service provided and which is remunerated in platform capitalism, but then also the data production that is happening simultaneously, which goes unremunerated. And then another example is micro work that happens on platforms such as Amazon Mechanical Turk, the click work that happens on online platforms, these small tasks which train machine learning or AI. They've been described as data labor as well. And all this suggests that labor is occurring at a very micro level, more fragmented and alienated than ever before. And two approaches to data labor specifically stand out to me. And this is my main intervention of my work. I'm describing one as liberal data labor, which is kind of grounded in this intellectual tradition of the Californian ideology described by Barbrook and Cameron, this hybrid of the new left, neoliberalism, techno-solutionist, techno-utopian idea that Silicon Valley is the savior and can provide technocratic solutions to platform capitalism's problems. But this presents some questions and some problems. So have they correctly identified this problem that people simply aren't being paid for their data labor? Is creating data labor markets a viable solution? Should we be selling our data on markets? Is that a correct response? Can we improve platform capitalism by legislating a data dividend? And will this be an actual true redistributive fix to wealth inequality? Again, here's some examples of the liberal approach in action. On the left here, you see a New York Times article with Jaron Lanier, a VR pioneer and Microsoft researcher, who says here remuneration will fix the internet. And then on the right, you have the Data Dividend Project, which is Andrew Yang's American politician, of course, the UBI advocate, universal basic income advocate, thinks that getting paid for your data will bring back control. I argue that data labor remuneration is an inadequate solution to this problem. I think paying users for their data labor is indicative of liberal reformism, in the words of Andre Gortz, and small piecemeal changes like this to improve the system over time and ameliorate the problems without addressing the underlying structural logic of the system is problematic. And this has been described by Nancy Fraser as well as affirmative versus transformative remedies. In effect, paying people for their data labor maintains the system rather than actually changing it. And I wonder if this is a desirable future in which hidden abodes of production or value are identified, commodified, and compensated. And ascribing property rights and creating data labor markets more resembles a potential digital feudalism, digital enclosure that reminds us of previous eras in the history of capitalism. Ultimately, are new, stable, and meaningful jobs being created through this process? Or is this looking more like a dystopian future with alienated micro work that benefits some more than others? Instead, I think there's a critical approach of data labor that can be taken. I think one that offers a much different perspective, one that is fundamentally anti-capitalist that is, more grounded in it's grounded in a different intellectual tradition, more of the European New Left, autonomous Marxism, where data work is kind of considered the latest in a long line of undervalued and unpaid labor. It can be considered in line with domestic care, consumption, attention labor, effective labor. So what the critical school kind of does is it questions and seeks to overturn the very logic of the system itself and offer real alternatives. So technological solutions are not going to fix the systemic underlying logic here, but there are truly radical solutions and visions of the future that do exist. One example is the platform cooperative option described by Trevor Scholes, where these platforms, are shared democratically amongst the workers rather than owned by an external, person, firm, group of people in Silicon Valley. There's this idea to collect data as part of a sovereign wealth fund, like you've seen in other sectors. This has been described by Nick Cernacek as well, or the idea of fully automated, post-work, post-scarcity society where we don't treat it as work; it's more considered a leisurely activity. So we can prioritize data's use value over exchange value, and I think it's imperative to recognize the social value of data through decommodification and disalienation of data production. And present here a typology of data labor of sorts, where, and I've adapted this from Ursula Hughes's work on housework, where the status quo here, where we have extractive data labor in the gig economy or social media, where it's unpaid and it produces value for capitalists, surplus value. And then the alternative that's proposed by the liberal school, what I've described here as data dignity or data dividends, this remuneration imperative. Sure, it's paid, but it still produces value for capital. And I think there's some other options that should be pursued, that should be considered, and by policymakers, by academics. This idea that it's either decommodified data leisure, where it's unpaid, but it produces social value, so it shouldn't matter that it's unpaid. And then alternatively, socialized data labor. So this is the publicly owned platforms, cooperatives, data wealth funds, like I described, where it's paid indirectly by funding social programs, but it doesn't produce value for capitalists. So it produces social value only. So it's just a nice visual here and a chart to kind of articulate some of these different approaches to data and platform capitalism. And to close, I will say that getting paid for all activity in the digital economy, it appears mildly better than the status quo. Indeed, there is a material advantage of more money, for the average user or worker under, a remuneration system. And perhaps this should be the bare minimum demanded by gig workers, and particularly by gig workers rather than social media users. I think, framing social media use as a form of labor, it's probably a difficult thing to develop, class solidarity around. The class consciousness of social media users might be a difficult thing to achieve. But gig workers, I think this is much more of an achievable goal. But I still don't think this addresses the underlying causes of these problems in platform capitalism. I think a more useful approach would be to reject these liberal remuneration reforms in favor of more impactful, transformative solutions, like I previously mentioned. This notion of data work as a vocation or a career more resembles a capitalist dystopia than an emancipatory future. I think paying people for data labor legitimizes and validates the exploitative relationships that exist in platform capitalism right now. It effectively turns all digital activity on Facebook or Uber or whatever into a form of gig work. And that's why I think more transformational approaches are necessary to address capitalism's creep into these new places. These intimate recesses of human existence are kind of being taken over here. And I think that it's crucial to kind of understand that and think of some legitimate solutions to the problem. So thank you for listening. Appreciate it.
Wonderful, Alex. Thank you so much. And we're going to keep an eye on you, and we're really excited about your upcoming work. So thank you for participating this afternoon. I'm going to step out of my role as moderator and present my work this afternoon. I'll actually turn to Lane, who can be the timekeeper for me, so make sure I am as disciplined as my colleagues have been. And my paper this afternoon is really on workers' roles in digital automation, and that is the promise for new organizing. So if you look or listen to the popular discourse around technology, the robots are coming, right? Computer-based automation, artificial intelligence, robotization are really the only factors that matter these days in the modern workplace. And it's almost as if it's a technological imperative, that there is no way to stop it, no way to intervene, that the technology is marching forward. I've spared you all the graphics of all the covers of all the magazines about the coming of the robots. But it's not just in the popular press. This is echoed in so many reports by the consulting organizations. So for example, Brookings argues that 25% of American jobs in the US are at risk of automation in the next decade. Now, not all economists agree with this. Larry Michel and Josh Bevins at EPI, for example, in their article called, I love the title, "The Zombie Robot Argument Lurches On." I could just see the graphic for that cover. They argue that there's actually very little evidence for this incredibly fast transformation and the increasing use of technology. But here's what's important to note. The vast majority of the literature on the future of work is written by economists. And it's written by economists who are only looking at workplaces from 10,000 feet. Because in many ways, they're not writing about the future of work at all. They're writing about the future of employers, the future of employment, the future of capitalism. And workers themselves are, for the most part, left out of this discourse. This was something that the AFL-CIO reflected on in their recent report on the Commission of the Future of Work and Unions. They wrote, "The astonishing technologies of the digital revolution have the potential to improve workers' lives, but also threaten to denigrate or eliminate millions of jobs. That's why in the US and around the world, key stakeholders are engaging in a discussion about the future of work. But they go on to lament and say, quote, but the conversation is happening around us, often without us. And I think that's actually quite an astute observation, because again, this huge literature is emerging, but with little focus on workers themselves. And from this long range view, one of the assumptions of so much of the writing about the future of work is that the Taylor project, Frederick Taylor's scientific management, was completed, and that employers in manufacturing and many other industries are actually exercising what Taylor had in mind, which is that managers and engineers design the work and then workers execute the work. And pretty much in much of this literature, the idea is that, okay, well, if engineers already know how to do the work, how to design the work, then all they really need to do is to give those instructions to the software developers, the robot, the cobot developers, and we will easily then automate those factories. The lights will be out and the machines will be working. But here's what's really important to note is that there are other scholars who actually look at the workplace. So within my field of sociology, there's a whole process, there's a whole subfield of people who study work in the labor process, from Marx through Braverman, through Burway, all through the current work that's being done today. Also, it's really important to note that actually engineers study the workplace, because in fact, actually the engineers are the people who are responsible for implementing technology in the workplace. But yet they've largely been left out of this discussion. So in my remaining time, what I'd like to do is talk about just one little slice of some research I've done as part of a big NSF grant on one manufacturing company, a quite large one in the US, and their efforts in one factory to increase automation. Now, what do we know from the labor process theory? Again, to summarize briefly, what we know is that Taylorism actually was never implemented fully as Taylor had in mind, right? And there's wonderful historical research on that. That, of course, the iron-fisted part of Taylorism, the vision of labor, highly segmentation work was, but the Taylor program of actually management designing the work never really happened. And when we look more closely, what we recognize is that workers actually retained much more skill, although unrecognized and uncompensated, than we believe. And many different kinds of skill, right? Michael Polanyi calls it tacit knowledge, or Pierre Bourdieu calls it habitus, an embodied knowledge. So for example, while it may be unskilled to cut one head of lettuce in a field, to pick 150 heads in an hour takes incredible habitus, embodied skill to do that. So I went to this factory and was introduced to the engineering team that was putting together this new technology. And I fully expected for them to mouth to me the Taylor line. We know how to do the work. We're going to develop the technology. And yet, much to my surprise, the engineer spoke quite frankly and quite casually about, oh yeah, we kind of understand how the process works, but we really don't know how it works. That knowledge resides in the workers. You know, it's the absolute opposite of what, you know, the Taylor program was. And they said, before we begin the process of automation, what do? We interview the workers, which is comical because it's exactly what I would do as a scholar, you know, work in the labor process. I would talk to those workers. And they gave me an example about how they interviewed a worker who noted that in the afternoon, because it got so hot in the plant, the material changed and they had to adjust the machine to make those compensations. And any kind of technology they built would have to take that into account. So the engineers and I were on exactly the same page, that any automation would require an understanding of the kind of complex and nuanced skills of those workers. But you might be saying to me, Juravich, so what? This may be important to you, but is this going to stop the engineers from harvesting that knowledge and doing exactly what Taylor did at Minville Steel, of coming up with the one best way and then, you know, going on to build this lights out factory? But here, and this is what I learned again from the engineers, it's like the lights out factory is the wrong metaphor. It's the wrong model. It's the exception, not the rule. And again, this is clear in the literature. And what the engineers said to me very casually, and again, this was a series of a team of about 7 of them who have incredible experience in a variety of different industries. They said, look, lights out factories only work when you're doing very simple operations in very high volume over an extended period of time. So those lights out factories we see of in auto, where we have machines welding, making thousands of the same weld repeatedly in the same model of car over and over. That repetition allows them to invest in the design of the equipment, the installation of the equipment, the maintenance of the equipment. But this is not the model. And they said for them, this is a company that has close to 100 plants across the US, and they make tens of thousands of consumer products. For them, there's no idea of a lights out factory that's really run by work. So for them, and I think for the majority of most people in terms of technology, and again, the literature bears me out here, is that this will not be the forward marching of the zombie robots, but this will be a very different process. So I watched them. I'm doing okay with time here. All right. I watched them as they work through these processes of automating this factory. So, and several principles emerged. The first one is they don't begin with technology. I have this really great quote from an engineer who says, yeah, we don't bring in the machine with the bells and whistles and then try to figure out how to use it. What do? They would do exactly what I would do as a labor process theory. They study intensively the work process, how material flows through the process, how workers and existing machines work in that. And then they look to see where are the places that automation could take place. So I'm there one day working with them, and a salesman is there for a major robotics company. And we're looking at this one operation, and I don't want to describe too much detail, but basically items come out of this machine and they're all lined up. But because they didn't have enough bins, workers then just threw them into a larger bin, and then another worker straightened them back up so they could go back into the process. And this guy quite astutely says, well, I can sell you a very expensive robot that will be able to find those objects and reorganize them, but why don't you just buy some more bins? This is a material handling problem, not a computer problem, right? Or in one other case, they show me that we go through an operation easily automated with a cobot. And again, cobots are simpler kinds of robots, but he says, you don't have the volume to pay for that technology. So I think this is a really different model of how technology and automation is going to happen. It's not going to be freestanding autonomous systems, but it's going to be integrating technology into already existing systems. And one of the engineers says to me, he says, do you know how much it costs for me to buy a machine that would do what my operator does? That is a machine that would essentially have vision and discretionary abilities and abilities to do what a worker was. So I think we're in a place where workers are going to continue to do a lot of production. And again, if we look across the world, garments, for example, I'm buffering here a little bit. Can you still see me or no? Yeah, okay. The garment industry, essentially, with the exception of computerized knitting, operates exactly as it did in the 19th century. Because why would we develop complex tools when we can pay mostly women in the global South pennies to create those garments? Or our farm workers, the same thing. There's great development of a tomato picking machine, but the millions of dollars it would cost is just not efficient based on what we can pay workers to do. So workers will continue to be a central part of this process. And it's not as though workers are simply going to be jettisoned by the lights out factory. And this is the key point for workers and the labor movement, which is that we're not just being jettisoned, but we, through our organizing, can have a real impact on how technology is utilized and how technology will interface with workers and the kinds of, can we create jobs that have dignity and pride? And can we build systems that reward workers for that productivity, that increased productivity that they're making? And right now, I'm beginning to work with the AFL-CIO's new Technology Institute. And we're going to conduct a dozen of case studies, because what's interesting for me to note is that there are already a number of great examples about how workers and their unions have intervened in the technological process. Again, not just being thrown out and having to be retrained, but actually in there, both in the collective bargaining process and on the shop floor, making interventions to change the way that technology operates. So I'm excited about that. I'll report back to that to you at some later meeting. But I also just want to make a call, is that we can't leave the future of work to the economists looking at work from 10,000 feet, that we've got to get down there in the workplaces, in the factories, in the hospitals, in the call centers, and really examine, explore, and unpack the real reality of technology in the workplace. Thank you very much. Okay, I'll put my moderator's hat back on here, and I will open the floor to questions. I don't know if there are any in the chat, but I will open the floor for anyone who might like to. We're a small enough group. You can literally raise your hand and turn on your microphone and ask a question. Luis, please. Are you able to turn on your mic? Maybe Lily will have to. Okay, let's see. Lane, can we turn on his microphone?
Yeah, he should be able to. I just hit the button that asks.
Okay.
There we are. There you are.
Yeah.
Yay.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for a wonderful session and a wonderful conference. I've been peeking in as I grade term papers this semester. So I guess I'm not sure my question is, maybe Uma and Raoul, is I don't want to change the emphasis. I just want to enlarge the emphasis in the sense that gig work and platform work seems to be something that's very sort of new and unfortunately really taking off. But I also want to introduce that we seem to be looking at the worker sort of in isolation. That I wonder what happens to the worker if we look at the entire work, the whole worker, in the sense of, given these vulnerabilities that these workers are now facing, what is their family life like? What's happening in the domestic sphere to compensate for this vulnerabilities, to enhance people's sort of identities in a situation where they're being undermined and undervalued and played with, right? Because often what we've seen in the history of labor processes, when we turn into the household, right, and make the connection between the public and the private, we see that the private does so much work now that capitalists have withdrawn from the reproductive work. So I'm wondering, I know this is a long sort of winded thing, but I wonder if we have any sort of that information with gig workers, what's happening in the domestic sphere, and who's compensating for this, right? Is the traditional sort of group, i.e. women, or men sort of participating, or what are they doing to compensate to sort of, for the situation?
What a great question. Uma, Raoul, someone want to take that first?
Do you want to take a couple of more and then we do, or I'm happy to go.
We could also do it that way if we'd like. We could take a couple more questions and then come back to our panelists. So another question? Please, Newt.
Yes, I think now I'm unmuted. Yeah, thank you for the presentation. And my question is for you, Thomas, if I may call you Thomas. What you described reminded me very much of experiences that we've heard from the German industrial unions, how they operate when automation is introduced in Germany through works councils, and basically interviewing, talking with workers, how are the processes, and then seeing, where's technology useful, but also what does it mean if we take this task from you? What does it mean for your job, and how do we make sure that what you do still for the company is productive and enhances your skills and makes you a useful member of the workforce? And so I was surprised that you described that for an American manufacturer, which seems not to be the norm. But correct me if I'm wrong. Isn't that exactly the problem of the US model, that this feedback from workers is not what we would traditionally see in US workplaces, or is what you've described more the norm than I have been aware of so far, for especially in the manufacturing world? Thank you.
Great question. Shall we take more? There's one question here in the chat from Juan, who says, what are the privacy implications for workers and customers with all these platforms that are being integrated into our daily lives?
Mhm.
So why don't we stop there and take and see if we can take those three questions and work them through. So Uma,
Happy.
should we start with you?
Yes, absolutely.
Fantastic.
I think it's been wonderful listening to everyone, and some very good, great questions coming in here, which could not be covered during the part of the presentation. I think this whole issue of domestic sphere and what actually happens is very fundamental and important. And what we did do in our surveys was actually tried capturing that. And very clearly, there are a couple of things that I would like to highlight. So the way the platform business model is working is it's sort of exploiting certain situations that the workers are in. And one of them is lack of employment opportunities for many of these workers, which actually pushes them into accepting these jobs, which look lucrative because of the lack of other opportunities that are there in the labor market. And that often results in actually huge conflicts between work and family life. You often find and I think I've given some of the numbers, like if you're talking about taxi drivers, they're spending about 65 hours in a week. That is double the time to almost double the time to what we are talking about a normal working hour. And the same applies for delivery workers. And you find a lot of online workers who are working in the evenings and during the night to basically try to get work, to have some sort of income that meets their needs. So I think the issue, it's quite a tense issue that is there within it, and often there's not really a recognition for this kind of work because nobody takes this work quite seriously, because this is not referred to as regular work. So often these workers are quite humiliated within the circles in which they actually interact, and this is something many workers have actually told us. And so I think it doesn't help them, but they are always with a hope saying that I need to earn income to meet my household needs, and hopefully I'll get a better job opportunity. And it's that hope that keeps them going. To the question of Juan with regard to the privacy implications, I think it has not really come down to many workers what this actually means. I think there's an increasing awareness that is coming out now with regard to the whole issue of data privacy, the whole issue of what it means to allow your data to be used for platform capitalism, as very rightly referred to by Alex, and saying that, by 1 point payment for the data that is used, is that a real compensation, because data that is collected by platforms can be utilized innumerable times in innumerable situations and can be sold in different forms. And I think neither the customers nor the workers, probably Europe is quite advanced with regard to it because of the GDPR. But I think many of the countries in the global south are really yet to understand what this means and the implications of it are. And I think we need to get into that issue a bit more aggressively to make people aware of it.
Fantastic. Raoul, would you like to pick that up from here and add to this conversation?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there was no quantitative aspect to the field research, so I can't actually. I can only speculate as to the various family situations. The folks that I spoke to did not seem to be in an age group or situation where, for example, children would have been an issue, childcare. and I don't think it's the kind of job, the bike courier world is I don't think it's a job that you will do once and if you have children. So the question that this raises, though, is what other sacrifices are made in the sort of work life balance, and what came back in several interviews is the toll it would take on their university careers, because these were often students and they were often out late, many hours, and it was always, okay, maybe I can make a little bit more money, pay off a little bit more of my student loans, or go more into debt and then be a little bit better. So I think that was the main tension in their private lives from what they reported. The other element that struck me was how many other jobs they were doing. It was just not the question about double apping. It was also, some of them were musicians, actors, various other precarious types of employment that were intermixed with this platform work. And that was certainly another element that struck me. But once again, it wasn't quantitative work. I couldn't tell you the exact statistics on it. In terms of privacy, I mean, I mentioned this element that had completely escaped me before, that essentially your number becomes accessible. You have access to all kinds of data as well, in terms of the addresses and the phone numbers of these clients, and all of it is owned by the platform. You own none of it, but you still have some of the risks of it being misused. For example, if a client's personal information then gets used fraudulently afterwards, the only face of the operation that these clients will see is the courier. So there once again, it's a complete imbalance about of who controls this and who gets the benefits from it, and who runs some of the risks related to privacy concerns.
Fantastic. Alex, would you like to jump into this discussion?
Yeah, just on the point of privacy, I think it's not necessarily an answer to the question, but I think it's really interesting that there's a definite generational divide between how people view their data, and how it's used by external parties. For example, I think there's a Pew Research study from 2019 that said it, for generation 65 and older, I guess like the boomer generation, for the most part, I think they're pretty they're not very okay with their data being shared to third parties, whereas the younger people are very much okay with it, especially when it related to their whether it's like fitness data that's tracked and being sold to by your Fitbit per se, and then that data then being sold to medical researcher, for example. Young people seem, according to this study, to be okay with that, and I think that's something to unpack. I mean, I don't really know necessarily what that means for privacy, but I think that it's definitely something to note. And I'll post that report in the chat here because I think it's quite interesting.
Great, thank you so much. And I'll jump in here to your question, which I think is just a great one, because I think the German Works Council model is an incredible model to deal with this technological change. And what the issues here in the U.S. First off, that unionization is so low, but also as part of the post-war compromise or uneasy truce, as Nelson Kunsting would describe it, and many unions gave away kind of workplace control. Right, that was part of that compromise. They took the money and they ran, and I think in a lot of industries and a lot of contracts, people are now beginning to realize the weakness in that particular social compact. And this raises this larger issue, is that there were lots of very complex contracts and rights, but many of them were not speaking about the workplace, and particularly around technology. And that was all well and good as long as the workplace wasn't changing. But so I think right now, I think unions in the U.S. are really having to rethink these issues. And I think it's going to be in the organized sector that we're going to see, I think, some real possibilities here in terms of having workers in the unions play a fundamental role in technological change. Okay, let's see. We've got a few more questions here in the chat. Let's see. How do workers communicate about unions or collective action on these platforms without drawing the ear of their employers? Do we want to add another question or two? We've got just about 14 minutes left. Any other questions in the house?
Tom, there's the one in the chat.
Oh, I'm sorry. There is indeed. In response to Dr. Juravich, how then platform workers can organize based on their knowledge about labor process? Unlike the factory regime, platform labor process is controlled by predetermined algorithms. So the question is, how do platform workers, how can they intervene and disrupt? Oh, what a great question. We've got two questions. Third one, anybody? Going once, going twice. Okay. Okay. Here we go.
There's one more.
One more. What policy recommendations did the panelists make for addressing the precarity of work and the lack of social protections on digital labor platforms? Oh, these three should get us at least two, if not far beyond our deadline this afternoon. So again, maybe we'll just go through the order. Uma, shall we start with you and addressing one or more of those questions?
Yeah, sure. I think I'm going to leave the second one to you about predetermined algorithms. I think with regard to how to communicate how do workers communicate about unions or collective actions, what we have seen, at least part of the surveys we have done, is they use the WhatsApp group, they have Facebook groups and other social media groups where they actually try messaging each other sometimes multiple times during the day or over the week. And they also have meetings actually in certain locations or places where they communicate some of the problems and issues related to the work that they're going through and try to solve them. So that's something happening all the time, but they are very conscious of the fact that the platforms do not get to know it. The minute they get to know that platforms are monitoring, then they're immediately out of these groups because they face deactivation of their accounts or they do not get any sort of work. And with regard to the policy recommendations, I think it's very clear that I think it's high time that we have an internationally coordinated policy response and dialogue. And I think one thing that hasn't happened and which has been started by the European Commission is having a social dialogue with the social partners. That is having a talk and a dialogue with the platform companies, which has not really happened. And I think this is very fundamental and important to address the whole issue of employment relationship, address the issue of working conditions of the workers on these platforms, and to ensure that the workers have social protection and they can actually put their proposal, if there is a problem, they can appeal the disputes in the local jurisdictions. And I think this is fundamentally important. And the other two issues that are becoming very important, which are not necessarily part of the labor law per se, is the whole issue around transparency and accountability of algorithms and ratings, actually, and the entire issue of data portability. I think this is something that needs to be brought in and discussed much more aggressively as we move forward with this platform business model. Thank you.
Wonderful, Uma. Thank you. Raoul, would you want to jump into this set of questions?
Yes, any of these three would have been great for a 15-minute presentation. I was working out on my PowerPoint. So I'll start with the second one, I think, because this is really key to how this campaign worked. And I mentioned the parking tickets as an example, but it's not just that. Like the labor process in this case is, how do I double park so that I don't get parking tickets? The labor process in this case is, which are restaurants that will let me use their bathroom or let me charge my battery? The labor process in this case involves, yes, all kinds of very practical knowledge around little potholes that you will ruin your bike in. And none of these things the algorithm knows, and all of these things only the couriers know. And sharing this knowledge and creating spaces to exchange this knowledge actually was very instrumental in organizing. And in terms of the combination that builds into it, ties into the question on communicating with the other workers. Now, for one, Foodora actually created a Slack channel for their couriers in Toronto. They regretted that bitterly at some point, I'm sure. It comes out of a sort of HR, create a sense of community among your workers type of textbook. But then, of course, if there's so many grievances and so many outrageous lack of respect, then it becomes a little bit of a shitstorm in the making. And then workers could identify each other and then find each other on Facebook and see, okay, that person has shared this type of story, and they were building up their lists. And the other thing they also did is they did work with the Uber guys from the beginning and shared lists in terms of people who were interested in organizing at Uber. And some of these Uber guys were also doing Uber Eats, and some of them were also doing Foodora. So this whole double apping thing wasn't only about economic dependency or independency, but also about building data, a database of organizable workers. So these type of things. And then, I mean, the whole city becomes the workspace, right? So you don't have a factory. So they had to have a communication campaign, obviously a publicity campaign, using these fuchsia colors, using that logo that I showed you, the Foodsters United and Justice for Bike Couriers, and it was everywhere. It was very expensive, and without the backing of that postal worker union, they probably wouldn't have been able to communicate with as many people in such a public way. And then, of course, you had the other communication coming back directly through the Foodora app, with the employer then urging couriers not to vote for unionization. So they used the app, obviously, for their anti-union campaign, but with not a lot of success, as the numbers in the end show.
Fantastic, Raoul. What a great response and insights from your research. Alex, do you want to jump in on these last set of questions?
Yeah, sure. In regards to how to disrupt and intervene, I think it comes down to seeking decommodified alternatives to profit-based platforms. And in my view, I mean, the gig economy itself was once considered synonymous with the sharing economy. That's kind of how it was coined at one point, and I think we've deviated quite a bit from that. And this is kind of touched on in Julia Shore's book After the Gig, which I would recommend. But there are examples of nonprofit platforms that exist. I mean, here in Ottawa, I know there's a tool library, for example, which I think operates much like a for-profit platform would, but it's you're not renting or buying tools. You're sharing them amongst people in your community. Of course, this takes a lot of grassroots organizing and a lot of work at the local level, but I think it's definitely possible.
Fantastic. I'll jump in on question number 2, Jiwan. I think that's a fantastic question, and if I had answered that before Raoul spoke, I would say I don't know, but I'm sure that there are these disruptions and these interventions, because what we know about algorithms and apps is that they are, they're no different than the instructions that a tool or die maker would get, or an assembly line worker. They are a theoretical idea of how to do the work, but actually, and again, this is, it is not Taylorism, because they haven't worked out all these details, Raoul. They have to figure out, right, how do you find a washroom? How do you charge a battery? All these very practical things, which are not in the algorithm or in the software. And I guess all I would call for, and I'm just, desperately calling for, is that, for us to do more research like that, Raoul, that we've got to get out there into the actual world of precarious work. And I think, in some ways, before I can talk a lot about recommendations, I think we need to just sort of jump in there with both feet and understand more about, the agency, these interventions, and the organizing that's taking place. And again, not just within unions, but the organizing that's taking place informally with groups in small workers. So again, starting to rethink about this social compact, I think we've got to really think about ways in which there are opportunities in precarious work, and just again, judging from my long career and sort of studying work and speaking with workers, I don't think, Raoul, your research is an exception. I think that those kinds of interventions are sort of pervade precarious work, and I think that's one of the things that we've got to research, we've got to celebrate, and then I think we've got to organize. So I think that's the sort of the next step in that process.
Can I just add one thing here?
Please.
I think that's true. I think you can have more disruptions as far as location-based platforms are concerned when you're talking about taxi and delivery.
Mm-hmm.
But when you get onto the online web-based platforms, I think we have to really find out how we can actually disrupt certain labor processes there. And I think that's where the challenge comes in. And you're very right. I think we need to understand that those disruptions much more clearly before we get into what needs to be done further.
Yes. Thank you. This is really nice. We're 4 minutes before our close. I always think it's a great joy when we can finish up on time or a little bit before time, unless there's some other question that someone is dying to have our panelists intervene in. Lane, do you want to talk about?
Yeah, I'll just jump in. And this group may be particularly interested to know that as part of this convening tomorrow, there's a session called Building the Next Economy, Labor Organizing Beyond Capitalism. And at that session, there's a group that is going to be launching right after it, like literally right after that session, something called Co-op Ride, a driver-owned ride-hailing platform. So this is one solution to what you all have been describing. And so they're experimenting with a co-op model. And then we'll also have a session on lessons from rideshare drivers and the politics of the gig economy. So organizing with rideshare drivers. So I would encourage folks to come out to those sessions. We also are going to have a great arts night tonight with a spoken word artist, and we're going to watch a movie called Union Time, which is about the Smithfield workers organizing. And then we'll conclude tomorrow's session with a great closing that'll include Mary Kay Henry, Lauren Jacobs, Reverend Alvin Herring, Tom Kochen, and moderated by Ruth Milkman. So please join us tonight and tomorrow for these sessions too.
Great. And if I can just again thank Lane and Joe and all the people at Georgetown who have put this together. It's been a fantastic panel, and all the panelists who worked so hard. It's been a pleasure to work with you, and I will look forward to staying in touch with all of you. So thanks again very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank
All
you,
right,
Tom,
panelists.
and all our panelists. Wow, great.
Good job, you guys. What a great questions too. All right.
Yeah, and we did record, and we are going to put everything up. So as soon as those are available, we'll let you know.
Great, fantastic. Okay, Lane, thanks.
Thank
Uma,
you.
I don't know whether it's too much to ask, but is your PowerPoint somehow available? I mean, I love to dig into very lengthy reports, but it was such a wonderfully succinct short version with so much important information in there. Is that something that you could share?
Absolutely. I'll share it with all of you.
Fantastic.
Loving it. Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks a lot. It was
Great,
wonderful.
everybody. Thanks again.
Thank
Wonderful
you.
And
session.
well, one thing, if you're into the, I don't know whether you know about it, but films are sometimes really instructive in these type of issues, right? Sorry we missed you, or Sorry I missed you. It's a British film. It is a phenomenal film on this whole delivery model of people having to buy their own trucks and then deliver Amazon parcels and stuff. I can only recommend it if you haven't seen it. It's a British film. It's sort of a documentary but fictionalized. It's really well done.
Yeah.
Wonderful Ken Loach film. Bring your wine, beer, or very strong whiskey.
Yes.
Yeah, the latter, yes. All right, sorry.
All right. Wonderful. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Good afternoon, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks so much. Take care.